So welcome everyone to this virtual tour today. We are lucky to be joined by Mr. Dale Couch. He is our curator of decorative arts here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and he will be talking about an exhibition that he curated. And I will turn it over to Dale, and he has a slideshow that we'll get started as well. So Dale, take it away.
Thanks. And now what are we viewing? I'm sorry to be incompetent, but are we viewing me or are we viewing the slideshow? Could I just have the slide?
We are viewing you right now, and I'm starting the slideshow.
Okay, the slideshow is more interesting than me. All right. Just to get started, this is in connection to the art of seating. This exhibit of children's chairs, the seated child. The art of seating is a stellar collection, a very beautiful collection, lent to us, and the person who formulated that, Dr. Jacobson, did an outstanding job of selecting masterpiece level American seating that shows the progress and innovation. We wanted to couple that with an entirely different kind of exhibition, hence the child's chairs. And then we'll be explaining what makes that different soon. It's important to know that there were a lot of people willing to lend to this collection that we were unable to accept their generous loans and wonderful chairs, important chairs, because when COVID lockdown happened, we were at the brink of finalization for all that we do with this, this kind of exhibition. And fortunately for us, many chairs have been brought. We had a few chairs there already, and Fred and Beth Mercier had brought their chair collection up for our selection. And as things closed down, art companies were not working and so forth, we had to go with what we had. So it is a somewhat truncated show, and I'd like for you to know that. But we're fortunate to have great early chairs, and I'll be delighted to show them. Now, as we get started, next slide, please. Just want to do a couple of things with basic technology. A lathe, for those who might not know, is a rotating, a tool that rotates a stock of wood, and the craftsperson takes a chisel or cutting tool and then scrapes wood off as it's rotating to sculpt it into a symmetrical form. That is a lathe. We're looking at a pole lathe from 1390. Notice the treadle down there. The man would work his foot, and to the extent we know, they were all men, he'd work his foot pedaling that, and the piece of wood would have the string wrapped around it and rotate back and forth, and he would cut as the rotation came toward him. And this goes back really into ancient times. And most of these little chairs that we look at, with notable exceptions, will have been created by small pole lathes. Next, please. Some, I think only two that I'll point out, were created by shaving. This is a draw knife. And by holding a piece of wood in a clamp, one could shave it to a certain shape, and that could become the components of the chair. Lastly, I want to mention, next slide, please, green wood working. Working green wood is different than working cured wood, and some of the components of chairs are deliberately green, and some of them are deliberately cured, and the green wood shrinks around the parts that are inserted, the tenons of the dried wood, and that is part of its strength. And that also is a medieval or earlier approach to wood. You can learn a lot about technology. You may Google Robert Trent's name. He is the leading chair historian, I think, in America. Largely, I regard Robert Trent as our senior scholar. And he's many publications in Winterthur Portfolio, and American Furniture, Main Antiques Digest, and other publications. Peter Folensby, many publications on YouTube channel. You can find those. Peter is the foremost practitioner of green woodworking, and you can see how the Pilgrims made it by watching Peter Follansbee. Harry Rogers in England has many videos in his YouTube channel devoted to green woodworking. And we'd be remiss to not mention the late Jenny Alexander. Jenny Alexander, sometimes Jack Alexander, another part of her life, wrote a book, Make a Chair from a Tree, An Introduction to Working Green Wood. It is our Bible. Many other online sources. Now, let's begin from this point. Next slide, please. Scale. One of the big things that I wanted to introduce is the idea that there is an independent aesthetic to a shift of scale. You can make a tiny chair. In fact, go to the next slide, please. Here we have many chairs. On the viewer's extreme right is an adult chair. In the foreground is a tiny miniature chair. Behind it is a toddler's chair. The chair in the center the tall chair in the center that's dark is a youth chair. And beside that is a doll's chair. And then beside that is a chair of ambiguous scale. Might it have been used for a toddler briefly and then used as a doll chair? That's a possibility. So scale varies things, but a shift in scale can be a very attention-getting thing. It can connote entirely different things. When we see children's furniture, we smile because we value children, and rightly so. And when we see miniature furniture, such as the tiny doll chair in the foreground, we sense a sort of magic scale at which miniature people exist. And you could take an average chair, make it perfect in a miniature scale, and it becomes its own masterpiece. So scale is an independent aesthetic. Next slide, please. That miniature chair, here it is, a close-up, and it all works as if there's someone that size that could sit in it. It's important that these things work. That's important to the makers as well. Next, please. A doll's chair could never have held a child. Next, please. A chair that might have held a toddler briefly, but not one in which she could have grown into. Next. A youth chair. Chair that might have been made anywhere, though I suspect New England for this chair. Next. And this chair is from Bergen County, New Jersey, along the Hudson River Valley. And here it'll be worth mentioning to you that this very sculptural chair with a lot of, think of the turnings as punctuations for that form, that nice, lean, delineated form. These chairs, is worth mentioning, are rooted in the 1600s, so this is probably an early 1800s chair. And that's how long the style continued in that region. Next, please. Now, we talk about continuity. One approach, and this is all about how we approach these chairs and how we look at them, is Baroque style retention. Sounds fancy and kind of is fancy because Baroque is elaborate. It's how we come to think about it anyway. But green woodworking and turned chairs may have reached their true glory in the 1600s. Now, they've been made for centuries, millennia for that matter, beforehand. But there does seem to be a style set. Next slide, please. Next slide. That is reflected in Baroque forms. One Baroque form is the vase turning. Now, you're going to catch me. Sometimes it's a vase in the museum and it's a vase at home. When I refer to a vase form, I sometimes refer to a vase. That distinction in art history has never been clear to me, and I don't think it is one. I think it's like laugh and laugh, right? But here is a vase that depicts a classical form that's existed at least from the 11th century in China. And this particular form, it entered the Italian vernacular. You know, vernacular just means folk, common language in most cases. In this case, it's an ornamental language. But it entered the ornamental language as after Marco Polo made contact with East and trade brought in porcelain. Next, please. So here, if you look under this very Baroque small chair, and this is one of our best artistic examples, this small chair, you'll see that same vase under two turned balls. Let's go to the next slide. To explain Baroque retention, this slide hopefully will help us. Here on the extreme left, you see that vase form in a 16th century Italian chair. And on the left, pardon me, the next one over from the left, and the following one, the two center ones, are Virginia chairs. And both of those have vasiform under their arms. And those vasiforms are based in those vases, and it's continuing. Now, these chairs, this date, the first chair in the upholstered chair dates to 1550. These chairs date more to 1750 to 80 or something like that. And the small chair that we're examining, next slide, dates to more like 1800. And here you can see the same thing. Now, here's why this is important. Historians study change over time. Consequently, art historians study style change over time. Here's my problem with that. I mean, change is important, but some things don't change or change very slowly. And those things are just as important to grasp, understand, and view to comprehend the human experience, the human condition, as is change itself. And one of the ways we approach these chairs is to appreciate them for their continuity. Next, please. And here we have a chair dated to about 1800 that in fact the style for which is deeply rooted maybe as early as the 1500s. And rather than say it's out of date, we look at it as a beautiful expression of continuity. Can you imagine looking at 3,000 years of Egyptian art and looking for the change as the basic thrust of the aesthetic when very little changes? I know some changes occur, but very little changes. So one way we approach these chairs is to appreciate their roots in their history. Next, please. Here's a chair from Piedmont, South Carolina, that the uprights, rather than slats going horizontal, it has spokes. This chair has a great many Baroque retained features. You'll notice the overhanging turned arms, and we'll speak to that later. Next, please. And here, very subtle Baroque retention. Notice the shallow turnings. We can call those cavettos or hollows. Hollow makes good sense in English. Those hollows are spaced in ways that they were spaced in the 1600s. And the continuation of just that small amount, that formula for punctuating the chair, is in itself a Baroque retention. Next, please. In Northern England, there was a tendency for two-spoke chairs. We find that reflected here. Next. And here's a South Carolina chair that's Baroque influences are residual from a continental influence. Now, a number of features, but most important features are the front rounds have small turned spokes or uprights or bobbin turning. There are, numerous ways to express it. And that is characteristic of a lot of continental work. And here, there's that incise decoration that you see, and that is reminiscent of various forms of Baroque inlay and Baroque carving. Simple chair, but very pleasing, and bespeaks the diversity of the American settler. Now, let's remember that many of these craftsmen were simply mostly farmers. Many were enslaved craftsmen working on small plantations. So the ethnicity that they're channeling, the style they're channeling, may not be their own ethnicity. And that's also a very American quality to these chairs. Next, please. A Southern vernacular. Let's go to the first, please. Next slide. This is not a child's chair, and this is not in the show. This is the earliest Southern chair. As I promised, I'll talk about these overhanging arms. Now, Sage, can you share the screen for me? Can I show something? Does this work?
Yeah, would you like to see the other slides, or what screen?
Let me see the next slide. Okay. Can you just share my face so that I can hold some chairs up and talk?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right, I'm going to end my share. And then we're going to spotlight on your face.
No one be afraid. I'll hold these up. Okay.
All right. Now people should be able to see you. Okay.
Here is a child's chair, very much in the continental mode. In fact, this is probably made in Europe. I say it's a doll chair, miniature chair. And notice the overhanging arms. Now here is a chair with the arms tenoned into the front post. Here they overhang the front post. Here they tenon into it. This really, in overall terms, can condition the gesture, the posture, the body language of the participant or the person seated. And to see this reflected, probably 80% of early Southern chairs are like this, out of continental influence, French and Dutch, and about 80% of early New England chairs, for example, are like this. Now, there are other northern chairs. I mean, the Hudson River Valley has exceptions. And this must never be seen. I'll hold these up one more time. Can you imagine this encouraging a more relaxed posture and this causing you to grip and sit more rigidly? Okay, we can return to the slides. I'm going to remove it there. Okay. All right, can we go back one? If that's possible. Okay, so here, the chair, that style of arm really entered as early as the 1640s, 60s into the American South. And here we have a chair that might have been made in the 1870s. And this chair shows many of the same qualities. This chair was possibly made by Thomas Varnidor, and it's from South Georgia. This is a remarkably well-provenanced chair. It also has an unusual seat, a rawhide seat. And that rawhide seat is a transfer from Iberian influences on the coast. And that's a very important aspect of Georgia chairs. And so it displays several norms of Georgia chairs, including the overhanging arm and the hide seat. These are characteristics of Georgia, not unique to Georgia. Next, please. And we can appreciate chairs. Here's another hide-seated chair from South Georgia by the Pierce brothers. Notice the little ball finials. This little chair looks like fun, and it's painted a 20th century color, which we would not alter. Next, please. And this is a fabulous little chair that was collected in the 1960s by the Coloni family. Mrs. Coloni executed the seat, and she stitched that seat, which is lovely embroidered. It has become something it wasn't. This is not the original seat, but we have a fabulous small child or doll's chair from that region fairly early, showing both vasiforms, overhanging arms, early paint, and then the way in which it was cherished by early collectors who were also major restorationists in North Florida. Next, please. And here's just a really successful chair. This chair stands on tiptoe. I don't think it was necessarily made as a rocker. It might have been. And those tiptoes, as you say, may have gone into rockers, or it may have been an option when the person was making this. But it has a loosely woven inner bark seat, characteristic of North Georgia and East Tennessee. And those heavy acorn, the massing of those finials, and just the relationship of parts, the negative space, creates a beautifully balanced and weighted chair. And that becomes artistic design. Well worth. We can appreciate the abstracts here, even when the design is not innovative. Next, please. Another beautifully balanced chair, 1840 to 90. My guess is much closer to 90. And yet it has these beautifully rendered, soft Baroque features that gives it balance, attenuation, articulation, and is a satisfying object. Next, please. And here's one without the Southern norm of the overhanging arms. Just to let you know, plenty of Southern chairs are not. It's more crudely turned, and it's had a hard life. It's been weathered. But the mere fact it was selected to exist, and every generation selects objects to exist. I mean, there's a filter. Most things don't continue to exist. Most things rot or torn apart or whatever. But this becomes delightful based in its own, the way it's weathered, in fact. Next, please. And here's another chair, painted its pink color. That's interesting. It's probably a 20th century color, but there seems to be a similar color underneath that. And that leads me to believe this could have been coded as a little girl's chair. Now, it's interesting. Pink and blue are not ancient codes for girl and boy. Pink and blue is a 20th century, largely late 19th, 20th century innovation for that sort of gendering code. But at some point, this seems to have been made perhaps for a little girl. Next, please. Just a beautifully patinaed small object. Again, ambiguous scale. It could have been used for a large doll or a small child, and it may have been used for both. Next, please. And here is a chair that's got a wide bottom, low to the ground. Notice the taper from heavy to light in the back post. And this heaviness is very typical of a lot of Georgia Piedmont chairs. And that could be a relatively early chair. Its finial is composed of stacked turnings and a suppressed ball. Those ultimately are Baroque memories, fading memories, but Baroque design nonetheless. Next, please. An important part of these chairs, and go forward if you will, is the fact that they got rugged use. If you look on the front of this chair, now it's been repainted or we wouldn't see paint on the front, you will see that the front has been worn flat. That is because these chairs were designed for children to turn upside down and push and learn to walk. They use them as walkers. We find this in numerous examples. So they were created for rugged use. And evidence of that rugged use has become part of their integral impact. It would be a crying shame to take that off. I mean, one could turn the wood and apply it and rebuild those flat spots, and that would destroy the character. Objects are not made and then abandoned. They continue to be made with use, with care, with abuse even. And sometimes that layers meaning onto the original design and manufacture. Next, please. Here's another example where the front has been worn by a child that was using it for a walker. So if you took these chairs and you sanded them down and you made them new looking, you filled those holes, you did everything you could, you put a new seat in it, that would be frowned upon by any serious collector. That they're valued in their original condition. They're valued for what they were made to be and for what they became. Next, please. Now, remember I said shaved chairs. Some chairs are not turned on a lathe. Next chair, please. Here's an example. I think this might have been made up in the Asheville area in the late 19th, early 20th century. And the seating and the backing of this could be river cane, which is a native bamboo, or it could be rattan, which is, it was introduced from Asia as a substitute for the loss of much of our river cane. Georgia used to be covered with river cane plains, much of it. And now those are rare. You can see some growing back at the botanical garden, for example. But this chair, you can't tell under paint, especially whether it's rattan or river cane. But this has a very arts and crafts quality. Also, if you look at I'm going to call them the ears. This is a strangely zoomorphic piece. It could be a donkey or something, you know. And I'm going to digress and just tell you one great aesthetic test for a, quote, primitive, if that's the word we use, a, quote, primitive piece of furniture is stand back and ask yourself, if it were in a Disney cartoon, could it come to life and dance? And if the answer is yes, it's a good piece. And this is such a piece. It could be a donkey maybe. But notice you can see the shaving here. You can see that this is not turned and smooth, but the facets there are the result of that draw knife. Next, please. Now, this, in many ways, was the most interesting chair. When I first saw a photograph of it, I assumed because of the loose inner bark weave. I should tell you that the inner bark, if you take the bark off of a tree, the next layer is inner bark. And it has a arch to it when it's pulled off in strips. And this is what this is. After that, you pull strips and you get flat splints of wood. Most of what we see in seating are splints of wood. And this is inner bark. It's a splint, but it's inner bark. So it has a sort of arch. So when I saw the picture, I just thought maybe East Tennessee or North Georgia. When I saw the chair, it was radically different to my eyes. Immediately, I knew I was looking. The through tenons, you see the round parts go all the way through the chair from the rounds or the list or the stretchers. You see that protrusion? That through tenoning is something we might, in this, well, there's several places in the world we'd see it, but notably Northern Ireland and North Britain in general. then that slope down arm, the attached flat rail, and even though it's not so apparent here, the shaping of that all related dramatically to Nova Scotia chairs done by, in the context of Irish and Northern British immigration. And I am sure this chair is from that region. In fact, the wood is birch, and that is a characteristic wood to use for chair making in that region as well. So there are ways to delineate region for many of these, but it's an exciting little chair made with a draw knife, some green wood, some not so green wood, and inner bark. Next, please. And just go to the next one. Chairs came to be mass produced. Here you see a little chair. It might well have been made in Baltimore. It might well have been made in many places in the United States. It's mid-19th century, and the continuous arm, which is a form of bended wood, is building on innovations by Samuel Gragg in New England, who invented this sort of wonderful streamlined bended wood. They use steam to bend the wood and to brace it and let it dry into that shape. But these were, it's hard, they're mass produced, but they're not quite industrial yet. Next, please. But mass produced and industrial chairs are gaining by the late 19th century to displace a lot of home craft. Here's a chair, I think it was probably made in Georgia. Probably, notice that this is, you probably can't tell that it is, but the replaced seat happens to be rawhide, and that alone suggests it's been in this vicinity for a long time. It's a pale green paint. Think about Victorian porches and all the turned elements you see. Well, in the 1850s, variety works came to be established, and these are town and city manufacturers that are using some new machinery, sometimes water-driven machinery, and they're making a variety of things. And they make chairs, they make Victorian porch ornaments, and so you can see that this might well have come from that. They also continue to bring in traditional craftsmen and work with them, so it's sort of a hybrid type of thing. So this brings us through the collection and some of our highlights. And I see Elaine Gurley's question, and I'm going to respond to it. So just hold on, if you will. Next slide, please. So the takeaway is we appreciate the impact of shifting scale as an independent aesthetic. We appreciate the retention of design, in many cases Baroque, as well as the innovation of design. We appreciate continuity as opposed to only innovation. We appreciate the social history and the physical impact of time on these objects. We appreciate the technologies for production. And sometimes we appreciate Piedmont regional mannerism of design. So, mannerism of design. It's the kind of phraseology I'm constantly guilty of. Let's talk, just before we close, let's talk a bit about Baroque design and mannerism. Mannerism is when something is changed. All of the Baroque design I've shown you is actually mannered because none of it is classic. Ideally, I would have shown you Baroque design. But let's summarize Baroque design as elaborate, using a lot of elaborate turned materials, and something that's running basically from, in our terms, 1630 to 1730. Now, many people break down mannerism as something else from Baroque design. I'm treating them together. So Elaine, I can't review Baroque style. I selected one aspect of it, the vasiform, which is characteristic, but I don't have the visual material to present it here. If we were in the gallery, I might be able to walk you down to some paintings with Baroque objects in them, and that might have allowed us to do more. I hope that answers that. Are there other questions? I really appreciate everyone coming and seeing this. I appreciate your efforts to do it. It takes effort to sit through this kind of context, and you know, I know that there I see a question I'm going to answer too. It's hard doing it because I like to look at people and I can't see you, and I don't know, I can't see your expression, so I don't know if I'm reaching you, and I can't point to the objects. It's hard for all of us, but it's fun and I love this stuff, and I'm so grateful we can do anything with it. And if we can go back, Sage, to a chair, let me just start going back farther. Stop. Okay. Go to back forward to an armchair, the red armchair. Okay. Let's talk about greenwood working. Okay. You see the slats in the back, the horizontal thing that your back would lean on. Now you see the post that's been turned that they intersect into. The man who made this would likely have made those slats and cured them maybe months ahead of time. If he had wanted to put a curvature in them, he might have racked them, put them on a rack and let them dry into that curvature. Then when he turned that post, he made a hole in that post, and he inserted, that's the mortise, and he inserted the part of the slat that's called the tenon in there. And that post would shrink around that, and that helps hold it together. And that is wood construction, greenwood construction that goes back into medieval times. It's ultimately, I believe, a Germanic development. Now, the same with all the horizontal elements. Those posts shrank over all of those rounds that we see, whether they're arms here, they're tenoned in, or whatever. And so greenwood working is something that takes advantage of how that wood will behave in the future within that object to create stability. And it takes a real understanding of what wood to choose, how cured to make the cured wood, how green you want the other wood. Because if you get it too green, it might tend to warp. I also saw on Lisa's comment that the chairs wear down, and that is correct. Many of these chairs were at a slightly higher position, and they wear down over time. This chair probably wore down at least an inch and maybe 2 inches, but not as much as you'd suspect, because it is made for children. And adults sat with their chair, until the mid-19th century, basically. Most chairs had your knees so that they were not dangling, they were not cut up. Your knees were above the level of the front chair seat. That meant, folks, that chair seat didn't cut your thigh circulation. And it probably meant there were fewer varicose veins. High seating, and this is relatively high seating, would impede circulation. So a slight squatting position was common to the vernacular of many people that lived with these kinds of chairs. Are there other questions, comments? Well, again, thank you so much for coming out. I hope that you'll get to see the exhibition. Looking at these chairs is a lot more entertaining than just looking at slides of them. And I'm happy to receive any questions anytime. And many thanks to you all.